Now, all of these pieces were pieces that existed and were appropriated as having a tone of mourning, right? At what point did people begin actually commissioning pieces to commemorate events?
Well, the first, I mean, there'd always been works of mourning, but mainly for personal losses, such as Brahms' Requiem that he wrote for his, really in thinking about his mother. But in World War II, it's the first time that we've found, and we'll stand corrected if others have other knowledge of other kinds of major commissioning programs for this, but a League of Composers, there was a group called the League of Composers, commissioned 17 works during World War II, and quite a few of them were performed by the Philharmonic, world premieres of this. And the composers were John Alden Carpenter, Henry Cowell, Howard Hanson, Roy Harris, Bernard Herrmann, even Charles Ives, which I think that's very interesting during the war. I don't know if all of these actually were written. The Martin but all these others, Mio, Douglas Moore, Walter Piston, William Grant Still, Roger Sessions, all wrote works that were then premiered during the war. And the music director at the time, Archer Rudzinski, the whole reason for it was, one, it was to document the time of the war, to document what was happening, either personally or if they felt like that they were going to document war, they could do that. And it was also a way of bringing people together. And the third reason was to give jobs to composers, which is never a bad thing. So it was probably something of a cross from the WPA project in the 1930s, carrying on as well to the 40s. But that was the first major commissioning project to document a major event.
Can you imagine what it must be like to be asked to compose a work to commemorate an event like this? Can you, John, imagine?
No, it was very, very difficult.
Yeah. And this isn't your first piece to address mourning or crisis.
No, I wrote, actually, in 1977, Personal Mourning, I wrote my clarinet concerto, which was commissioned by the Philharmonic and reformed with Stanley Drucker and Leonard Bernstein. My father was the concertmaster of the New York Philharmonic for 26 years, 23 years.
Who was in this video, too.
Who was in that video,
He was
yes.
in this video.
As was John Wummer and Harold Gomberg.
Yes,
I saw all the players.
Oh, okay.
He died in 1975, and the commission was performed in 1977, and the second movement is Elegy, and it's an elegy in which the solo clarinet and the concertmaster have a duo. They play together, and it was the first music I composed for the whole concerto. And in fact, with the duet between them was the first thing I composed. After that, massive tragedy was my first symphony. My first symphony is written for my friends who have died and one who was dying of AIDS, and was commissioned by the Chicago Symphony and was performed by Daniel Barenboim in 1990. And I wrote that piece having lost so many friends that my address book was littered with names that people who didn't exist anymore. And finally, when my closest friend of 30 years from college days, Sheldon Shkolnick, a fantastic pianist who lived in Chicago, was diagnosed with AIDS, which was a death sentence in those days. I went to the Chicago Symphony and asked them, and they said that, of course, I could write this piece. And I wrote the piece, and the first movement, in fact, is all about Sheldon and has a solo piano in it because he was a great pianist. He lived through the 2 years it took to compose it and died a week after the premiere. But he heard it, and he accepted the dedication to it. And that was a massive war, in a sense, but a war against a virus that nobody knew about, and in those days didn't know how to fix.
That piece, of course, has some something in common with the piece we're going to be hearing in a few weeks, but much that's different also. I think it'd be great to hear a little bit of the First Symphony.
Well, let me introduce the first movement and play. We're going to play about 3.5 minutes of the first movement to then show you how it ended. Because in both pieces, in this particular work, that One Sweet Mourning and my First Symphony, I wrote the last movement first. And the reason is that when you're dealing with this kind of tragedy, you really have to understand what you're going to say at the end of it. I mean, you can be rage-filled, you can be sorrow-filled, but what are you telling people at the end? So let me play you the first movement, which is called Of Rage and Remembrance, subtitled Of Rage and Remembrance. And you will hear the rage from the string section almost pushing up as a fist and breaking through and a crash and breaking through and a crash. And then the trumpets and horns all explode. And then the music starts to accelerate as a frantic heartbeat would, of fear and panic, and gets faster and faster and faster and faster until it reaches a peak. And the high strings are left very quietly playing. And offstage piano is playing, and it's playing Leopold Godowski's arrangement of Albanese's Tango, because that was a favorite piece of my friend Sheldon's. And in the recording you're going to hear, which is the Chicago Symphony and Daniel Barenboim, Stephen Huff, the great pianist, volunteered his services and flew to Chicago for no fee to play the offstage piano because he so loved Sheldon's playing and Sheldon. So he never took a bow. He just was off stage and played as an offstage piano. So this will take about 3.5 minutes, because I want you to get to hear the difference between the rage and the remembrance and what happened to the piano. And then just a tiny excerpt of the last movement to show you why I wrote that first. So you can hear how the rage was dissipated, and then these mournful strings keening over the Albanese tango. Now, the last movement of this piece was the thing I really worried about, as I did in this. What are you going to say to people? And what I wanted to convey to everybody was a sense of remembrance, keeping your friends who have gone alive, that we can keep them alive through permanence and remembrance. And I tried to get an oral image for things like the stars we see that we know were there before man was ever there and after man will be gone. And the oral image I picked was ocean waves, these simple waves at the seashore that lull you. When you go to the seashore, you always feel more relaxed because you know that before the little creature that became man crawled up from the sea, those waves were lapping the shore, and after everything is gone, they'll probably be lapping the shore too. They give you a sense of real peace. And so I set the entire brass section in a semicircle around the orchestra, starting with the first trumpet, then two more, then two more, then two horns on each side, two more, two trombones, and two tubas. A note would start like a wave crest and gently move around as it got lower and lower. And when it got low, the next wave would start, and the next wave would start. And over those waves sings these friends. So you will hear, when you hear this excerpt, you'll hear the beginning waves, and then you will hear the Albanese tango in that sea of waves, floating as remembrance forever. Other friends are being remembered there. Second movement was written for a man very beloved in New York, who was the head of Baldwin Pianos, and who was, I wrote a tarantella movement in a piano four-hand piece dedicated to him way back in 1970, before AIDS was ever there. And that tarantella became the tarantella of Insanity in the second movement, when AIDS, dementia, was what he had. And so all of the movements are based on friends, and the final one is a kind of quilt of many, many friends, many, many melodies, and then finally this last epilogue with these melodies. And it's in One Sweet Morning, the one thing that came to mind when Alan asked me to write this piece was that I had to end it with actually a song. And it is a song that I had already written. But the text was so perfect for what I wanted to say about the fact that in these days, we must look forward to the day where the rose blooms and where the sun comes out and spring arrives and there is no more war and there's one sweet morning. And it's written by Yip Harburg. Yip Harburg, as we know, for the Wizard of Oz and for the musicals he's written. But he was also a wonderful poet of little tiny poems, and this was the larger poem of his that I set. And I was going to do that with an long orchestral interlude, because they wanted a 25, 30-minute piece, and the song is only about 5 or 6 minutes long. And that's where I hit my real obstacle, and the fact that I could not write an orchestral piece about this tragedy for a very particular reason. The reason is that if I wrote an abstract piece in which strings were playing and then you reached a huge climax and then the timpani and the bass drum come in and the trombones come in, everybody would just have to play those awful, awful hours that we all sat and watched over and over again on television of the plane coming closer, the plane hitting the building, the people falling from the tops of the building. We know these are ingrained in our heads so much so that I could not write anything abstract without a kind of movie being played to them that I never meant, that I would not have meant. I would have meant that strong thing to be strong feeling of dynamism, of tragedy, of something else. But I had to direct the audience to the fact that those things were not specific to what we visually know so well. So I ended up writing 4 songs, the last one being One Sweet Morning, and the last one being the one that was written first.
It's the quality of the two works is so different. I was thinking what an extraordinary experience it must have been for you as a composer to have started with that last wistful movement of the First Symphony and work your way all the way back to that rage that it opens with. Mm-hmm. Was there a similar process working your way back through the 4 songs of One Sweet Morning?
You see, I think we all are, at this point, very emotionally attached to the situation of this horrible thing that happened on 9/11. But it's 10 years later, and we see it a different way than we did that season when John Adams wrote his Meditation, which was a shorter piece, and it was a meditation with words from the victims and all sorts of things that he added that specifically made it a meditation on the transmigration of souls, is what he called it. Now we're looking back and we see this tragedy, and we also look at Syria, and we also look at Libya, and we also look at what's happening in England and what's happening all over the world. And we look further back before 9/11, and we see this endless pattern of destruction of people, of other people. And I think that, to me, was what I wanted to talk about. I want to talk about war, about the idea of destruction. And so the 4 poems I chose do that. They talk about it, and I'll explain how. I went for my resource material to the YMHA Poetry Center, which is a fantastic place to be. And the people there were very, very helpful. And I explained what I wanted. And then they sent me over email tons and tons and tons of poetry to look at of various poets. I wanted, first of all, I wanted the poetry to be from all ages and all nationalities and countries, because war is not American, or is it European, or is it Asiatic. It's universal. I wanted it to be of all times. I didn't want it to be of 2001. I didn't want it to be specific, site-specific of that. I wanted, in fact, to be of all times, going back to ancient Greece. And so I explained this to them, and this is what I came up with. And it was a way of setting the order of the poems that is almost like building a piece of music, where you set the first poem to set a certain kind of mood of what you're trying to say and feel. And the second poem challenges that and goes another direction. And the third poem looks at the second poem perhaps another way. And then we have our final fourth poem. So the first poem is by Czesław Miłosz, a very great Polish poet. And it's called A Song on the End of the World. Now, you all have those poems, and I don't expect you to read them now, but it's a great poem. It was written in Warsaw in 1944, you can imagine. And the end of the world looked very close indeed. But he painted a picture in this that was quite odd, because all the images in the poem are of serenity, ordinary life. A drunken man lies on a lawn, women walk in their parasols, a dolphin jumps in the sea. All of this is very, very ordinary life. A sailboat rounds the corner, a violin is playing in the distance. And we get the feeling of peace, but underneath there's a tension. And so this song is very soft. This song does not reach a climax, but we have to know that what he's really saying is, no one believes it is happening now. And when we hear those chilling words, it's really 9/10 of 01. That is the day before. No one believes it's happening. No one believes that our world could change tomorrow. And yet now we all do. But this was the poem I wanted first, the poem of people who are innocent and do not realize that the end of the world might be tomorrow. And with today's technology, indeed, it could. So that was the first setting. And it was very tranquil and very soft and very soft. And then smashing into that, careening into that with trumpets and horns and drums and all the battery the Philharmonic can muster, is a section from the Iliad of Homer, which is all about battles. And it's Patroclus's battle in which he has so many people that he kills in so many different ways that it is just horrifying to read. And the first sets of kills are all described in gory detail and have to be sung out. Luckily, we have Stephanie Blythe who can sing out and make the halls roar, because this is where she will be doing that. And then it goes on and on, this various people that he approaches, the next one driving a chariot, the next one running away, the next one against a wall, and each one of them is described in great detail. And finally, there's so many that Homer ends up, and he killed, and he lists them, just like the list of the victims of the AIDS tragedy. He killed the son of Nexus, he killed Physes, he killed so-and-so, he killed so-and-so, and so-and-so, and so-and-so, and so-and-so, and this long line, sinewy line in the lower brass rises up and rises up and rises up as she sings this litany of names, just like we now do. And finally he says, and piled on this great body we call the earth. And that is the second setting. For the third setting, I went to 8th century China, Li Po, a great poet who wrote a poem about tragedy from the distance. And this is a poem in which the viewer is watching battle on the Great Wall of China, watching the warriors like ants, and watching them fight and fall, and the birds like carrion do, carrying pieces of them away, and the burning sun. These images are quite horrific, especially because at the very end of this, Lipo reveals that, as she says, my husband and my sons are fighting there as the drum beats on and on and on and on. And you suddenly realize it's a mother and a wife who's watching this from the distance, this battle. And then there is an interlude that builds to a big emotional climax based upon all the materials you've heard that goes down, and peacefully we begin One Sweet Morning and end with that. So that was the structure of the piece, which I built. Then, of course, the little job of composing it happened. And that was an agony in itself. But first, before you can compose it, you have to build it when you're building a cycle of this nature. And I wanted the audience to be taken on a journey. And that was the journey I thought was appropriate. War forever. And then the hope at the end that Yip Harburg gives us, that one day spring will come, peace will come. And he ends, and we feel the final quality of peace as a thing to hold out for hope. And that's how I ended that. So that's basically the story of the piece.
Well, I think we now get a terrific treat, actually, to hear that final song, the song that generated the whole work.
Right.
Would you care to introduce the performers?
Cherry Duke is the mezzo-soprano, and Stephen Gosling, the pianist, who will, and